On the morning of August 12, 1843, the silence at Willowbrook Plantation in South Carolina's Low Country was torn apart by a woman's scream. What Catherine Hargrove walked in on inside her husband's private quarters that morning would set off a scandal so profound that newspapers refused to publish the details for 6 decades. Within just 3 days, more than 300 residents had assembled in Beauford's town square to watch a punishment so savage that those who saw it carried the memory to their dying day. The county placed all related records under seal until 1923. And when historians finally broke those seals, they uncovered a reality far more sinister than any gossip had suggested. This went far beyond simple betrayal. It was about the systematic dismantling of a man's spirit, engineered by the one person who understood precisely how to turn an entire community's fury into a weapon. Before we go further into the story of Willowbrook Plantation and the ruin of the Hargrove family, I need you to do something. If this tale is already sending chills down your spine, hit that subscribe button right now. We dig up the most chilling true stories from America's past, the ones that were deliberately erased from the record. Drop a comment and let me know which state you're listening from. Are you near where this horror actually happened? Hit subscribe, because what's coming next is even worse. Now, let me transport you back to 1843, to a time when reputation was everything and losing it meant ceasing to exist. In the early 1840s, Beaufort, South Carolina, was a place built on paradoxes. Spanish moss draped from ancient oaks like funeral veils, beautiful yet suffocating. The air carried the scent of salt marsh and magnolia blossoms, a sweetness that couldn't quite hide the rot underneath. This was a land where fortunes grew from fields worked by enslaved people, where grand white-columned mansions competed to display the most extravagant wealth and influence. The Hargrove family sat at the very peak of this society. Edmund Hargrove, 35 years old in 1843, had taken over Willowbrook Plantation from his father 7 years earlier. It spanned 3,000 acres of rich land, featuring a Greek Revival mansion completed in 1838. Crystal chandeliers imported from France, heart pine floors so perfectly fitted the joints were invisible. Edmund was the picture of what a South Carolina gentleman ought to be. Tall, with dark hair and broad shoulders shaped by years of riding. He dressed flawlessly, spoke with the unhurried cadence of inherited wealth, sat on the town council, and held a position as church deacon. People considered him a fair master, which in that era meant he didn't whip his enslaved workers as often as his neighbors did. But Edmund Hargrove harbored a secret that would bring everything crashing down. Catherine Hargrove, born Catherine Petton, had wed Edmund in 1837. She came from Charleston money that matched the Hargroves' own. Their marriage had been arranged, as most were back then, a union meant to strengthen both families. She possessed the kind of beauty Southern society prized, pale skin kept from the sun, dark hair styled perfectly, a waist corseted to the fashionable extreme. She had been schooled at Charleston's top academy, trained in French, piano, watercolors, and the delicate skill of running a household while appearing to do nothing at all. Their wedding had been the highlight of the social season. 400 guests filled St. Michael's Church. Everyone declared them the ideal couple. Everyone predicted their children would be stunning. But 6 years into the marriage, there were still no children. This was whispered in drawing rooms, always with that blend of pity and judgment society reserved for women who couldn't fulfill their main duty. Catherine felt the sting of those whispers. She noticed Edmund's mother's barely concealed disappointment. She understood her worth was shrinking with every passing year. What Catherine didn't fully grasp was why there were no children. Why Edmund came to her bed so seldom, why he felt so distant, his thoughts elsewhere even when his body was there. The truth lived in the slave quarters behind the big house. The truth had names: Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. Marcus was 24, the son of the plantation's head cook. His light skin and features hinted at a mixed ancestry no one dared mention openly. He had worked in the main house since he was 15, first as a footman, then as Edmund's personal valet. He was sharp, able to sense needs before they were spoken, gliding through the house like a ghost. Samuel was 26, worked in the stables. He was darker than Marcus, muscular from hard labor, with hands just as skilled at handling horses as they were at mending leather. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, an inner strength that slavery couldn't entirely crush. Edmund had noticed him 3 years earlier and started finding excuses to visit the stables more often. Daniel was 21, a house carpenter talented at the detailed woodwork the plantation required. He was slender, almost fragile, with long fingers and an artist's eye. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice was soft and careful. He had learned young that staying invisible meant staying alive. Edmund had been cautious, extremely cautious. He met them separately, never together, always late at night in the East Wing where Catherine never went. That section was supposedly under renovation, closed off and unused. Edmund had created a refuge there, a room with its own entrance from the gardens, simply but comfortably furnished. It held a large bed, heavy curtains, a lock, and oil lamps that cast a soft, forgiving glow. This arrangement continued for 3 years. Edmund kept up his public persona without a flaw. Church every Sunday. Business handled with sharp efficiency. Smiles exchanged with his wife across dinner tables. And late at night, while Catherine slept in her separate bedroom, as was proper, Edmund would go down the servants' stairs, cross through the darkened gardens to the East Wing, where one or more of the 3 men would be waiting for him. These men had no real choice. They were property. When their master summoned them, they came. Whether they felt desire, fear, resignation, or some tangled mix of all 3, their feelings didn't matter. Survival meant going along with it. Refusal could mean punishment or being sold away from family. So they came when called, stayed silent, and told themselves they were at least safe from the fieldwork that destroyed other men. They had slightly better food, slightly better clothing, small privileges Edmund granted in return for their silence and their bodies. But secrets, no matter how well guarded, eventually find a way out. In a house where dozens of enslaved people moved through the shadows, where wives lay awake listening to creaking floorboards, where jealousies and resentment simmered beneath every exchange, a secret this huge could only stay hidden for so long. Catherine had picked up on things, small things at first. Edmund always locking the East Wing door. Him seeming energized some mornings, almost cheerful, after weeks of being moody and distant. Marcus moving through the house with a particular tension, his eyes never quite meeting hers. Samuel always in the garden late at night when he should have been in the quarters. Daniel sometimes with bruises on his neck, marks that looked like they might have come from fingers, from lips. She had noticed these things and pushed them away, because the alternative was unthinkable. No Southern gentleman would do such things. Impossible. Unnatural. Against God and nature and every law of civilized society. But Catherine was no fool. She had been raised in a world where women learned to observe, to read the subtle signals men thought they were hiding. 6 years as the wife of an increasingly distant husband, enduring pitying looks and whispered remarks, feeling her worth fade with each childless year, slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a foundation, the truth had begun to penetrate the walls of her carefully maintained denial. On the night of August 11, 1843, Catherine made a decision. She would uncover the truth. Whatever it was, no matter how terrible, she would see it with her own eyes. Catherine waited until the house was dark and quiet. She heard Edmund's footsteps in the hallway, heard him go down the servants' stairs. She gave him 10 minutes, enough time to reach the East Wing, to settle in, to feel safe. Then she rose from her bed, wrapped a dark shawl around her white nightgown, and followed. The garden was lit only by a quarter moon and the faint glow from the slave quarters. Catherine moved carefully, her bare feet silent on the brick paths. She could hear cicadas in the trees, the distant sound of the river, and her own heart pounding so hard she thought it might wake the entire plantation. She reached the East Wing. The side door was slightly ajar. Light flickered from inside, casting shifting shadows. Catherine approached slowly, her breath shallow, hands trembling. She looked through the gap in the door. The room was bigger than she had expected, furnished with a care that made it clear this was no temporary setup. The bed dominated the space, covered in fine linens Catherine recognized as missing from the household inventory. Oil lamps cast warm light across the scene. Edmund was on the bed, unclothed, his body tangled with 3 others. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were there with him, moving together in ways that left absolutely no doubt about what was happening. The sounds, the intimacy, the obvious ease of their movements spoke of a relationship that was ongoing, practiced, and comfortable. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the scream that rose in her throat. She stood frozen, unable to look away, unable to process what she was seeing. Her husband, the respectable planter, church deacon, pillar of the community, was engaging in acts that were not only illegal but were considered the very depths of depravity. In 1843 South Carolina, what Catherine witnessed was a crime punishable by death, not just for Edmund, but for Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel as well. The law made no distinction and showed no mercy. The act itself was called sodomy, though that word was rarely spoken aloud. It was seen as an abomination, a sin so terrible that even discussing it could corrupt decent people. Catherine watched for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. She watched Edmund kiss Marcus with a tenderness she had never experienced in their marriage. She watched Samuel's hands move across Edmund's back with obvious familiarity. She watched Daniel whisper something that made Edmund laugh, a genuine, unguarded laugh she hadn't heard in years. In that moment, watching her husband display more authentic emotion and desire with 3 enslaved men than he had ever shown her, Catherine felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. It wasn't just betrayal, though that was there. It wasn't just humiliation, though she felt that too. What she felt was rage, pure, focused, calculating rage. She had given this man 6 years of her life, endured whispers and judgment, diminished herself trying to be the perfect wife. And all the while, he had been here in this room with these men, living his true life while she lived a lie. Catherine backed away from the door, her mind already racing. She returned to the house, climbed the stairs to her room, and sat at her writing desk. Her hands were steady now, her breathing calm. She lit a candle and pulled out paper. She began to write 3 letters, one to Edmund's mother, one to Sheriff Charles Dunmore, and one to Edmund himself. In each one, she described what she had witnessed, sparing no necessary detail to convey the full horror. She sealed all 3 letters, then walked to Edmund's door and slid his letter underneath. She returned to her room and lay in bed, fully dressed, waiting for sunrise. Edmund found the letter at dawn. He picked it up, broke the seal, and read. The color drained from his face. His hands began to shake. He read it 3 times, as if repetition might somehow change the words. Catherine had seen him. She knew everything. And she had already written to the sheriff and his mother. Edmund's first instinct was panic. Run. Saddle a horse, ride north, disappear. But where would he go? He was a plantation owner whose entire identity was tied to this land. He had no skills beyond managing enslaved labor and maintaining social standing. Without Willowbrook, without the Hargrove name, he was nothing. His second instinct was denial. Maybe he could convince Catherine she had misunderstood. But even as these thoughts formed, he knew they were desperate and foolish. Catherine had described details that proved beyond any doubt she had witnessed exactly what she claimed. His third instinct was rage. How dare she threaten him? But that rage died quickly, because Edmund knew the truth. He had betrayed her, lived a lie, and in the rigid moral universe of the antebellum South, what he had done was unforgivable. He walked to Catherine's bedroom and knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. He knocked again, harder. Catherine, we must talk. Please. Her voice came from behind the door, calm and cold. There is nothing to discuss, Edmund. The letters have been sent. Sheriff Dunmore will arrive within the hour. Your mother shortly after. I suggest you use whatever time remains to make peace with God, since you will have no peace in this world. Edmund pressed his forehead against the door. Please, Catherine, I can explain. Explain how you have spent 3 years defiling yourself and your slaves. Explain how you have made a mockery of our marriage and our name. There is no explanation that matters, Edmund. You are a sodomite. That is what you are. That is all you are. And everyone will know it by sunset. Sheriff Dunmore arrived at 7:30 with 2 deputies. Catherine met them at the door, still in her nightclothes. She invited them inside, offered coffee, and explained the situation with the calm, measured tone of a woman reporting a property dispute. The sheriff was a large man, 60 years old, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen every kind of human wickedness. He had known Edmund since Edmund was a boy, had attended the wedding, been a guest at Christmas parties. As he listened to Catherine describe what she had witnessed, as he read her detailed account, his face darkened, a mix of betrayal, disgust, and the cold determination of a man who knew exactly what the law required. "These are serious charges, Mrs. Hargrove. The most serious a man can face in this state." "I am aware, Sheriff. Which is why I sent for you immediately. My husband is in his study. The 3 slaves he was with are in the quarters. I want them all arrested. I want this handled according to the full extent of the law." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Where did this incident occur?" "The East Wing. There is a room there furnished for this purpose. You will find everything exactly as I described." Sheriff Dunmore motioned to his deputies. They moved through the house with Catherine leading. She showed them the East Wing, the side door, the room itself. The bed was still unmade, the lamp still burning low. Evidence of what had occurred was everywhere, impossible to deny. The sheriff's jaw tightened. This was a violation not just of law, but of the entire social order. Edmund Hargrove was one of the wealthiest men in the county, a respected citizen, a community leader. And now he would have to be destroyed, publicly and completely, because the alternative was to let such behavior stand unpunished, which would shake the very foundations of their society. "Arrest Mr. Hargrove," the sheriff told his deputies. "Bring him to the town jail. Then go to the quarters and arrest the 3 slaves, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel." The deputies moved to the study. Edmund did not resist. He stood when they entered, set down his glass, and held out his wrists for the shackles. His face was blank, empty of expression. He looked at Catherine once as they led him past her in the hallway. She met his gaze without flinching. "I hope you understand what you have done," Edmund said quietly. "This will destroy you as much as it destroys me." Catherine smiled, a cold, terrible smile. "I know exactly what I have done. I have revealed you for what you are. I will survive this, Edmund. I will return to Charleston, to my family. I will be the wronged wife, the innocent victim of your depravity. But you will be nothing. Just a name people whisper about. A cautionary tale. A warning about the consequences of unnatural vice." Edmund said nothing more. The deputies led him outside to a waiting wagon. Within minutes, he was on his way to the Beaufort town jail, shackled like a common criminal. His fall from grace had been so sudden and complete it seemed almost unreal. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were taken from the quarters in chains. Their families watched in silent horror, understanding that their loved ones were caught in something that would likely end in death. In 1843 South Carolina, slaves had no legal defense against such charges. If a white man claimed they had participated in sodomy, their guilt was assumed. By noon, all 4 men were locked in separate cells. By evening, everyone in Beaufort knew. The news spread like wildfire, whispered in shops and parlors, discussed in horrified tones over dinners, debated in taverns. Edmund Hargrove, the respectable planter, was a sodomite caught in the act with 3 male slaves. His wife had discovered him and reported him to the law. The scandal was so enormous it dwarfed every other topic. Nothing else mattered except this one terrible revelation. The week between Edmund's arrest and his trial felt suspended in time, as if all of Beaufort was holding its breath. The town had never experienced a scandal of this magnitude. Murder, yes. They had seen theft, adultery, drunkenness, violence, all the usual sins had passed through the courthouse. But this was different. This touched something deeper and more terrifying. A violation so profound it threatened the very order of their world. Judge Howard Middleton presided over Beaufort County's legal proceedings. He was 68 years old, a veteran of the War of 1812, known for his strict interpretation of the law and his unwavering commitment to maintaining social order. When he received the documents related to Edmund's arrest, he sat in his chambers for over an hour, reading and rereading the charges. He had known Edmund since childhood, had signed the marriage license, had approved loans for Willowbrook's expansion. Now he was being asked to preside over Edmund's destruction. The law was clear. South Carolina statutes defined sodomy as the abominable crime against nature, prescribing punishment of either death or such lesser penalty as the court deemed appropriate, though the statute strongly implied that death was preferred. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The act itself, if proven, demanded the harshest consequences. But Judge Middleton faced complications. Edmund was white, wealthy, from a founding family. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were enslaved, property, legally worth perhaps $800 each. The law theoretically applied equally, but in practice, everyone knew the enslaved people would be punished more severely and quickly. The question was how to handle Edmund without creating a precedent that might threaten other wealthy white men with secrets they preferred to keep hidden. On August 15, Judge Middleton called a private meeting. Present were Sheriff Dunmore, County Prosecutor Richard Fellows, 3 prominent citizens including the mayor, and 2 church deacons. Catherine was not invited, nor was anyone representing Edmund. "Gentlemen," the judge began, "we face a situation requiring both justice and discretion. The charges against Mr. Hargrove are supported by unimpeachable evidence. His wife witnessed the crime directly. Physical evidence corroborates her testimony. If this were any other men, any men of lesser standing, we would proceed directly to conviction and sentencing without hesitation. But it is not any other men." Mayor Thomas Pritchard interjected, "It is Edmund Hargrove. His family has been part of this community for 3 generations. His plantation employs hundreds directly or indirectly. If we execute him, what happens to his slaves? His property? The debts he owes and the debts owed to him?" Prosecutor Fellows, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, shook his head firmly. "With respect, Mayor, we cannot allow considerations of wealth or status to interfere with justice. If we treat Mr. Hargrove differently than we would treat a poor farmer or shopkeeper, we undermine the entire foundation of the law. The crime is the same regardless of who commits it." "Fellows is right," Sheriff Dunmore added. "I have the men in my jail. I have the 3 slaves who participated. If we let any of them escape justice, what message does that send? That the wealthy can do whatever they wish? That the law only applies to common folk?" Reverend Samuel Cartwright spoke, his voice grave with moral certainty. "This is not merely a legal matter, gentlemen. It is a spiritual crisis. What Mr. Hargrove has done is an abomination before God. It corrupts the natural order, threatens the moral foundation of our society. If we show mercy, if we soften the punishment, we suggest that such behavior is somehow forgivable. We cannot do that. We must not." Judge Middleton nodded slowly. "Then let me propose a course of action. We will hold a trial. We will present the evidence. Given the circumstances, conviction is certain. But I will use my discretion in sentencing. Mr. Hargrove will not be executed." The room erupted in objections, several men speaking at once. The judge raised his hand for silence. "Hear me out. Death would be a mercy for a man in his position. A quick end, a closed coffin, a private burial. His family could mourn and move on. No. What I propose is worse than death. A public punishment of such severity that Edmund Hargrove will wish we had hanged him. It will destroy not just his body, but his soul, his reputation, his very identity. It will make the entire community witness it, so that everyone understands exactly what happens to men who commit this crime." "What form would this punishment take?" the prosecutor asked. Judge Middleton's expression was cold and calculating. "The pillory and whipping post in the town square. But not for an hour or 2, for 3 full days. Locked in the pillory from dawn to dusk, exposed to the elements, the insects, the jeers and curses of everyone who passes. And at noon each day, a public whipping. Not enough to kill him, but enough to scar him permanently. Enough to ensure that for the rest of his life, he carries the marks of his shame on his body." The room fell silent. Even the men most insistent on harsh punishment seemed taken aback by the brutality of the proposal. And the slaves? Reverend Cartwright asked quietly. They will be hanged, the judge said without hesitation. They are property who corrupted their master. They seduced him into depravity. They will serve as an example of what happens when slaves step beyond their place. Their executions will precede Mr. Hargrove's punishment by 1 day, so that he knows what his actions have cost them. Sheriff Dunmore frowned. That is not just, Your Honor. By all accounts, Hargrove initiated these relationships. The slaves had no choice. They could not refuse their master. Justice and necessity are not always aligned, Sheriff. The law requires that all participants in sodomy be punished. More importantly, white citizens need to see that natural order is restored. White men may fall, but they fall from a great height. Slaves who participate in such acts must be eliminated entirely. It is harsh, but it is the only way to maintain control. The men exchanged glances. Slowly, reluctantly, they nodded in agreement. The solution satisfied no one completely, but it balanced the competing demands of law, social hierarchy, and the need to make an example that would resonate far beyond Beaufort. But Judge Middleton had not factored in Catherine Hargrove. She was not present, but she had sources. One of the judge's clerks, a young man named Benjamin Porter who was courting Catherine's cousin, overheard the conversation and repeated it to his fiancée, who immediately sent word to Catherine. When Catherine learned of the plan, she was not satisfied. She had wanted Edmund destroyed, but she had not considered that Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel would be executed. Despite everything, despite her rage, she understood that these 3 men had been trapped in an impossible situation. They were property. They had no choice but to obey their master's commands. To execute them for Edmund's depravity seemed like a miscarriage of justice, even by the twisted standards of slave society. But Catherine also understood something else. If Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel died before Edmund's public punishment, if they were hanged and buried before the town witnessed Edmund's humiliation, then Edmund would become a kind of martyr. People would whisper that he had loved his slaves, that he had sacrificed himself for them, that there was something tragic and romantic about his fall. Catherine could not allow that narrative to take hold. She sent word to Judge Middleton, requesting a private meeting. He agreed, curious about what the woman at the center of the scandal could possibly want. They met in his chambers 2 days before the trial. Catherine arrived dressed in full mourning black, though no one had died. It was a deliberate choice, a visual representation of the death of her marriage, her hopes, her future. She sat across from the judge with perfect posture, her hands folded, her expression calm. Your Honor, I have heard of your intended sentence for my husband and the 3 slaves involved in his crime. The judge raised an eyebrow. That was a private discussion, Mrs. Hargrove. How did you come to know of it? In a town this size, Your Honor, very little remains private for long. But I am not here to question your authority or your judgment. I am here to make a request. Speak, then. I request that the punishment of all 4 men occur simultaneously. That Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel not be hanged separately, but be present during Edmund's 3 days in the pillory and at his whippings. That they be forced to watch what becomes of the men who used them. And that Edmund be forced to watch their executions on the final day, after his punishment is complete. The judge leaned back, studying her. That is remarkably cruel, Mrs. Hargrove, even for a wronged wife. My husband showed me no mercy, Your Honor. He showed our marriage no respect. He showed God's law no reverence. Why should I show him mercy now? Why should he be granted the dignity of being punished alone, where he can imagine himself a victim? Let him see what his desires have caused. Let him watch those 3 men die, knowing that his actions brought them to the gallows. Let the entire town see the complete picture of his depravity and its consequences. Judge Middleton was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Your request is granted. I will modify the sentence accordingly. The trial will proceed in 3 days. The punishment will begin the day after the verdict. It will be exactly as you have described. Catherine stood, smoothed her black skirts, and offered the judge a small, cold smile. "Thank you, Your Honor. Justice should be complete. The entire story should be told. Nothing should be hidden." The trial began on August 18, 1843. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles, crowded the doorways, pressed against the windows, all trying to hear every word. This was not just a trial. It was the social event of the decade. A spectacle that would be discussed and debated for years. Edmund was brought in wearing shackles. He had not been allowed to change clothes since his arrest. His once fine shirt was stained and wrinkled, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had already died inside, going through the motions of living because he had no other choice. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were brought separately, also in chains, and made to stand in a corner of the courtroom, guarded by armed deputies. Their faces showed different emotions. Marcus looked resigned, almost peaceful, as if he had accepted what was coming. Samuel's jaw was set, his eyes burning with quiet rage. Daniel was trembling, tears running silently down his face. Judge Middleton took his seat. The prosecutor rose and presented the charges. Then Catherine was called to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head held high. She wore dark gray now, still mourning colors, but slightly less severe. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and then, in a clear, steady voice, described in exact detail what she had witnessed on the morning of August 12th. The courtroom was utterly silent as she spoke. Men shifted uncomfortably. Women fanned themselves, whether from the heat or from shock, it was impossible to say. Every word Catherine uttered was like a hammer blow, destroying Edmund's reputation, his dignity, his very humanity. When she finished, the prosecutor asked, "Mrs. Hargrove, is there any possibility that you misunderstood what you saw?" "No, sir. There is no possibility of misunderstanding. What I witnessed was clear, unmistakable, and deliberate. My husband was engaged in an act of sodomy with 3 male slaves. He was not coerced, not confused. He was participating willingly and enthusiastically in acts that violate every law of God and man." The defense attorney, a young man named William Crawford assigned to Edmund's case and clearly wishing he had not been, stood for cross-examination. "Mrs. Hargrove, is it possible that your husband's behavior was the result of temporary insanity, that he was not in his right mind?" Catherine's eyes narrowed. "My husband has been engaging in this behavior for at least 3 years, Mr. Crawford. That is not temporary insanity. That is a deliberate choice. That is who he is." Crawford tried a few more questions, but each one only made Edmund's situation worse. Finally, he sat down, defeated. There was no defense to be made. The evidence was overwhelming, the witness unshakable. Edmund was asked if he wished to testify. He shook his head. What could he possibly say? The truth was undeniable. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were not allowed to testify. Slaves could not give evidence in court except in limited circumstances, and this was not one of them. Their guilt was assumed based on Catherine's testimony and the physical evidence. They had no voice, no chance to explain or defend themselves. They simply stood in the corner, waiting for the inevitable verdict. Judge Middleton addressed the jury, though everyone knew their decision was predetermined. "Gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the testimony, you have seen the evidence. The law is clear on this matter. Sodomy is a crime of the highest order, an abomination that threatens the moral fabric of our society. You must now determine whether the accused are guilty of this crime." The jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. "We find the defendant, Edmund Hargrove, guilty of sodomy." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Some voices expressed satisfaction, others sounded shocked even though the outcome had been certain. "We find the slaves Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel guilty of sodomy and of corrupting their master." This verdict was delivered more quietly, almost as an afterthought. The 3 men's fate had never been in question. They were already dead in the eyes of the law. The jury had simply made it official. Judge Middleton nodded. "The court accepts the verdict." We will proceed to sentencing." He paused, letting the tension build. Every person leaned forward, waiting to hear what punishment would be decreed. "Edmund Hargrove, you have been found guilty of the abominable crime of sodomy. The law permits me to sentence you to death, and many believe that would be an appropriate punishment. However, I believe death would be too merciful. You have violated not just the law, but the sacred trust of your position. You have corrupted your slaves, abused your authority, and brought shame upon your family and your community." Edmund closed his eyes, waiting for the sentence to continue. "Therefore, I sentence you to 3 days of public punishment. You will be locked in the pillory in the town square from dawn to dusk each day. At noon each day, you will receive 20 lashes with a whip. You will be marked permanently, so that for the rest of your life you carry the evidence of your crime upon your body. And you will witness the execution of the 3 slaves whose lives you destroyed with your unnatural desires." A gasp went through the courtroom. 3 days in the pillory was brutal enough, but 60 lashes total would leave a man scarred and broken. Forcing Edmund to watch the executions was psychological torture that many found excessive, even given the severity of the crime. As for Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, the judge continued, turning to face the 3 enslaved men. "You are sentenced to death by hanging. The execution will take place in the town square on the afternoon of the 3rd day of Edmund Hargrove's punishment, so that he may witness the consequences of the corruption he brought upon you." Daniel collapsed. The deputies caught him before he hit the floor and held him upright. Samuel's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched into fists. Marcus looked directly at Edmund for the first time since the trial had begun, and the expression on his face was not anger or fear. It was something worse. It was pity. Judge Middleton struck his gavel. "This court is adjourned. The sentence will be carried out beginning tomorrow at dawn. May God have mercy on all your souls." The courtroom erupted in conversation as people filed out. Some were satisfied that justice had been served, others were disturbed by the severity. Many were already planning to attend the public spectacle, drawn by morbid curiosity and the knowledge that they were about to witness something that had never happened in Beaufort before. Catherine left without looking at Edmund. She had achieved what she set out to do. The truth was public. Edmund was destroyed. She would soon be free to leave this place and never return. Morning came too quickly. The sun rose over Beaufort, casting golden light across the town square. Already people were gathering, chairs were set up for prominent citizens, while others stood in groups talking in low voices. Children had been kept home, but teenagers and adults filled the square until there was barely room to move. In the center stood the pillory, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, and beside it the whipping post, a thick wooden pole with iron rings for securing the condemned. Both had been freshly painted, as if someone wanted them to look their best for this historic occasion. At dawn, Edmund was brought from the jail. He wore only trousers, his torso bare, his feet without shoes, his hands bound behind his back. The deputies led him to the pillory and locked him in position, his head and hands secured, his body bent forward, completely immobilized. The morning sun was already hot. Within an hour, Edmund was sweating. Within 2 hours, flies had found him. Within 3 hours, his back was burning from sun exposure and his legs were shaking from the strain of standing in one position. And the people watched. Some jeered and called out insults. Others simply stared in silence. A few felt pity but kept it to themselves, knowing that expressing sympathy for a sodomite would bring suspicion upon their own character. Catherine arrived in the mid-morning, accompanied by 2 female relatives from Charleston who had come to support her. She stood at a distance from the pillory, not close enough to speak to Edmund, but close enough that he could see her if he raised his eyes. She wanted him to know she was there, witnessing his humiliation, ensuring it was complete. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel had been brought from the jail and forced to stand at the square's edge, chained together, guarded by deputies. They watched Edmund's punishment with varying reactions. Marcus kept his expression neutral, showing nothing. Samuel watched with grim satisfaction, glad to see the men who had used him now suffering. Daniel could not watch at all. He kept his eyes on the ground, unable to bear the sight. At noon, the real punishment began. Sheriff Dunmore approached the pillory with a long leather whip. The crowd fell silent, every eye fixed on the scene about to unfold. "Edmund Hargrove," the sheriff announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You have been sentenced to 20 lashes. May this punishment serve as a reminder of the consequences of your crime and as a warning to any other men who might be tempted to follow your path." Edmund's body tensed. He had been whipped once as a child, a few strokes for childhood mischief, but that had been nothing compared to what was coming. He tried to prepare himself, but there was no preparing for this. The first lash came without further warning. The leather strip cut across Edmund's bare back with a crack that echoed across the square. Edmund gasped but did not cry out. A thin line of red appeared on his skin. The second lash followed quickly, then the third. By the fifth lash, Edmund was groaning with each blow. By the 10th, he was crying out, unable to maintain his composure. By the 15th, he was sobbing, his body shaking with each impact. The skin on his back was torn in multiple places, blood running down to soak into the waistband of his trousers. The 20th lash finally came. Edmund sagged in the pillory, held upright only by the wooden frame that imprisoned him. The crowd was silent now. The initial excitement of witnessing punishment had been replaced by the uncomfortable reality of watching a human being broken. Sheriff Dunmore coiled his whip and stepped back. Edmund would remain in the pillory until sunset. Still exposed. Still suffering. But at least the whipping was over for today. He drifted in and out of consciousness as the afternoon stretched endlessly. People came and went, some staying for hours, others just passing through to see the spectacle with their own eyes. Finally, as the sun approached the horizon, the sheriff returned. He unlocked the pillory, and Edmund collapsed immediately, unable to stand. The deputies caught him and dragged him back to the jail, where a doctor had been ordered to examine him and ensure he would survive to endure the next 2 days. The second day began exactly like the first. Edmund was brought out at dawn, locked in the pillory.